Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ali to get us started.
Hello, colleagues. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our final BU School of Social Work, Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series event, Disability Justice and Mental Health with Isabel Alvarado Dees. My name is Ellie Zambrano. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health at BU School of Social Work. I'm also a member of the Equity and Inclusion Committee here at the school. Our Equity and Inclusion Committee includes all BU School of Social Work stakeholders, faculty, staff, students, administrators, and alumni. The committee has been around for many years, engaging in the work of building equity, inclusion, justice, and anti-oppressive practice here at the school, as well as amplifying social justice focused activities in the community. Some of the work we have engaged in includes organizing social justice, solidarity circles, and mentoring for anti-oppressive teaching and practice, learning communities, creating anti-oppressive teaching, learning labs, and student support. We have a wonderful resource page available to anyone that includes podcasts, peer-reviewed literature, and media articles that encourage everyone to check out, that I encourage everyone to check out on our Equity Inclusion resource page. Finally, we have a 3-hour online module on structural and institutional racism, again, available to anyone in the world that can access it online as well. I'm going to briefly review our format for today. I'll introduce Isabel Alvarado Dees, and she will present for about 30 minutes. We will then have 3 members of our BU School of Social Work community offer a 1-minute reflection about the talk and ask Isabel a question. Finally, we'll be able to answer a few questions from our audience that you can type into the chat. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few Zoom housekeeping items. Anyone who's receiving CEUs will need to keep their camera on during the entire session. If you're not getting CEUs, we recommend turning the camera off during the presentation. If you're receiving CEUs, you'll need to complete the evaluation form. We'll type that link into the chat with the evaluation form at the end of the presentation. We will be recording the presentation. So if you aren't comfortable being recorded and you aren't receiving the CEUs, you can keep your camera off during the speaker's presentation. We'll be posting the recording on our E&I speaker series page a few days after today's talk. We also suggest having your Zoom setting on the speaker's view. All participants during this presentation will be muted. Please do not use the chat during Isabel's presentation, as it can be distracting for the speaker. Closed captioning is available for this event. You can access this through Zoom. If you're joining by computer, click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you click on live transcript, please then click on enable to start the closed captioning. If you're joining by phone, you go to settings, meeting, and then closed captioning. Finally, it goes without saying that all the comments in the chat should be respectful and mindful of our entire BU School of Social Work community. We would like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement reminds us all that colonization is an enduring reality and that Boston University sits on the stolen traditional lands of the Massachusetts people. If you're outside of Boston, please take some time to learn about the tribal lands where you live and the ongoing movements to have land honored, acknowledged, and returned. These past years have been challenging in so many ways, with COVID-19 unmasking the devastating long-term effects of racial capitalism, transphobia, ableism, and gender inequity. The timing of Isabel's talk couldn't be more appropriate for a historical moment, where we as social workers, part of the world community, stand at a crossroad. In this BU School of Social Work Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series event, guest speaker Isabel Alvarado Dees will lead a discussion about supporting people with disabilities in your daily practice. The conversation will focus on accommodations, universal design, and the changing the language we use to discuss disability and mental health. Isabel Alvarado Dees is an educational rights advocate with more than 10 years of experience working in compliance in higher education. She identifies as a member of the disabled community, which informs her holistic approach in meaningful inclusion through agency models of service and transformative justice principles. Please join me in welcoming our BU School of Social Work, Equity and Inclusion speaker, Isabel Alvarado Dees.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here in community with you all. I'm gonna start sharing my screen and get us started. Okay, so like Ellie mentioned, we're going to be talking about disability justice and mental health today with a focus on access, identity, and inclusion. Overall, we'll review disability and the law. We'll talk about diagnosis and access. We'll discuss what accommodations are and review what the interactive process is. And then talk a little bit about disability bias and disability as identity. As we go through these topics, we'll talk about them as with a dual lens. So both in your role supporting others and navigating access, and your role in your own practice, right? Examining bias and your approach to these things, and finish off with some strategies for fostering meaningful participation and inclusion in your own practice. It's the law, you know, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, 503 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And California has a California Fair Employment Housing Act, and most states also adopted kind of their own version of the Fair Employment and Housing Act. So it is absolutely the law that folks with disabilities need to have access, that services need to be provided for folks with disabilities. And so that's one reason why this conversation is important. Under the law, we have an obligation to ensure that programs and services are made accessible to everyone. And it's particularly important to note that communications with people with disabilities must be quote unquote as effective as communications with others. And I bring that up because more and more, especially in a post-pandemic world, the interwebs has become a place. It is a place where folks can go and access information. There are some interactive features on some folks' sites. And so making sure that those electronic communications are as effective is an important part of access when we are talking about disability. So to the extent that there is information or support available in your own practices online, this is an important frame to keep in mind. There are generally two strategies for supporting access and meeting this obligation. One is the accommodations model, the other is universal design. And I say universal design because that is the broadly accepted language, and we'll talk a little bit about where it came from. But I like to say inclusive design. Because universal implies that we could anticipate universally what might be necessary for everybody, but inclusive design invites us to be reflective and incremental and revisit our practices. So you'll see universal design on the slides, but you'll hear me say inclusive design. I just want to make sure that you have access to the literature that supports this kind of practice. Okay. So in addition to it being the law, it's also like the right thing to do. For most of us, the institutions that we work with and our own personal commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion align with taking steps to ensure access and participation. You wouldn't be here participating in this series if there wasn't already an alignment and purpose and values for you. Another reason is that access is a value that benefits everyone, right? So when we design for disability, we all benefit. And I really want us to think a little bit about, it isn't about how it benefits the person being included, whose access is being supported or facilitated, but how their presence in our community benefits the community. And some kind of architectural examples I'll use, for example, curb cuts on sidewalks certainly were designed to ensure wheelchair access on public streets. But I certainly make use of them when I'm traveling and I've got like my rolly cart. And when I had the babies and had like a giant stroller to push around, I was really so glad that there was these curb cuts. Those curb cuts really supported my mobility. And so thinking about things like that. Another example I like to point to is text-to-speech software. Certainly in its nascency, it was technology that was designed to address a particular disability-related need. But how many of us use text-to-speech software when we are talking to Siri or changing the channel on our Xfinity remote control, etc. So or asking for directions in our car because we are attentively driving at 2 and 10, right? So I just really want to invite us to think about benefit as a community value and not necessarily as like a kindness for the person being included. Okay. And then diversity includes disability, right? So diversity drives innovation, right? And so I just mentioned a few things that may have begun as technologies or designs specifically to address a disability related need, but have like universal value, right? And then, just to be a little soapboxy, but like disability justice is social justice, right? You can't have one without the other. So it's the law, it's the right thing to do. We all believe in it. It's why we're all here. And with that, I wanted to share with you what the legal definition of disability is, right? So under the ADA, a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And I'm going to read it to you again, because when I first read this definition years and years and years ago, I was shook because I thought for sure I knew what a disability was. And then I read this. I had to read it a few times. Physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity, right? So with that definition, take a moment and think about who walks through your door that is not experiencing something that was the impetus for coming to you that is causing a limitation or impact on a major life activity. I can't sleep, I can't focus, I can't get out of bed, I'm having trouble completing assignments at work. And so life activities, right? It's affecting my relationship with my children, right? Mental, and I don't like the word impairment, but that is the word that the law uses, right? So it's really important as we think about mental health that we get comfortable with any diagnosis may meet the legal definition under the ADA of what a disability is. And we'll unpack that a little bit more. But think of yourselves as being a gateway, you might say, that anybody who walks through that door may in fact be a person with a disability, right? And getting real comfortable with that frame. That's one definition. There's 3 of them. The second is a history or record of physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So sometimes within your social work setting, you may have referral, and what you're getting is not someone voluntarily coming in identifying impact in a major life area or activity, but what you're getting is a report of impact or impairment in a major life activity or area, right? And then the last is important for those of you who work in places like the VA or other government offices. Anyone that is regarded as having such an impairment, whether they have the impairment or not, is also a person with a disability. And that's a little bit nuanced, but for example, if you have been discharged from military service as a result of disability, then the government can't turn around in a different setting and deny your disability claim. Right, so that there needs to be consistency. If you cannot continue to be employed as a result of disability, then your unemployment or disability claim cannot be denied. Okay. All right. It's important to note that disability can be permanent or temporary. It can be chronic or episodic. And like most mental health conditions, most disabilities or some disabilities can be invisible. You'll hear ringing every once in a while because half an hour is not very long, and I want to make sure we stay on track. And so breaking that out, permanent disabilities, those are permanent. And this will surprise you. Anything that is lasting or impacting for more than 6 months, right? So if you are needing to check in 6 months to see if it is continuing or not, likely that person qualifies for access and support and rights under the ADA as a permanent disability. Temporary folks with temporary conditions may also have rights under the ADA. So anyone with a condition where the prognosis is less than 6 months is likely to resolve may still be eligible for rights and protections under the ADA. And that's really important for you to know. The reason is that the principal vehicle and protection that the ADA affords is a right to accommodations, right? So as a practical tool for addressing the impact in a major life activity like school or work or like housing, like I'm trying to get housed. Housing is hard. It seems like I can't fill out these applications. They're only available online. I'm not able to navigate, right? So it's our principal vehicle for mitigating that harm or that lack of access is accommodations. So it's really important as folks in a position to make a diagnosis of a quote unquote impairment that you have front and center that may entitle that person to support, practical support and legal rights under the ADA to address the impacts that they've come to your office to address, right? Accommodations are appropriate adjustments, auxiliary aids, and services that are necessary to afford a person with a disability equal opportunity to participate. Notice that like help is not in the language. It isn't a help. It isn't like voluntary. It's nobody's gracious act. It is a right. It is a right that folks are entitled to, and you play a critical role in helping to inform folks of that right and also to frame your diagnosis and or support as related to an important protected right. Modifications can be to an environment or a program. They could be things like an extension to complete an assignment. They could be things like a change to the number of folks assigned into a dormitory, things like that. They typically are remedial. They mitigate a lack of access and they require disclosure. But they do benefit everyone, not just the person asking for access or participation. Some examples of accommodations are here, and I include them because it's important to think practically about what that could mean. Sometimes folks will say, you know, if only I had a note taker for me, I could focus a little bit better on what was being said in that important meeting, and then I would be able to track assignments and tasks a little bit more easily. If only my desk, you know, were able to go up and down, I would be able to stay for your 3-hour-long meeting and not, you know, need to leave, et cetera. So it's important to think practically about what might it mean to change the standard way of doing business or of engaging in this program or of delivering this talk, for example, that might additionally facilitate access, inclusion, or participation by other members of our community. What's important there is that in imagining accommodations, we are framing this conversation already as a failure in design, right? We did not anticipate this need. And so the lack of access is not a moral judgment or a deficit for the person requesting access. It's a plenary problem. We did not know that somebody with hearing loss or somebody who was deaf was going to be present in our program, and we did not plan appropriately, right? So it's important to think of accommodations as remediating a design flaw and not fixing something innately wrong with the person asking for access. Accommodations have to be reasonable, right? So they have to be tied to the need, right? So it allows an otherwise qualified person to perform the essential requirements for a particular task at hand. It addresses the individual need of the person with a disability, and allows the person with a disability not mere access, but meaningful access, right? This centers dignity and respect, and it's important to know that complaints and suits filed under the ADA use that as a legal standard. And I say that because dignity and respect is a high bar. And so when we're talking about how to be inclusive, thinking about whether that is a dignified response, whether that is a respectful response, is an important contribution more broadly to an access, participation, and inclusion framework, right? When we're talking about diversity, imagine how transformative dignity and respect as a legal standard in other instances where we talk about access and inclusion could be. When we talk about appropriateness of accommodations, it's important to understand that it's not a request to alter requirements, to degrade achievement, etc. It's to ensure that whatever is being asked does not fundamentally alter. It's about access. It's not about a separate track. And this last bit does not impose an undue hardship for the institution or the business. Some of you may have a solo practice. Some of you may be part of a larger practice. And so it's like, do the best you can with what you got. And the standard that you're held to will vary depending on the resources available to you. So the lack of funds is not an excuse to not engage in this exercise. It simply means that the toolkit might be more limited, but what's important is to demonstrate an effort to identify strategies which may support access and inclusion. Okay, so this is important before I go to the next one on two frames. One, when you're supporting individuals coming to you to address impact in an area of life, it's important that you understand that this is the standard that will be assessed and used by the school, by their employer, by the housing authority, right? So that you can provide support for that individual in navigating access and navigating request. It's also important for you to know that that's the standard. So if you're going to write a letter saying that this person should be given accommodations, that you're writing the letter in such a way that protects privacy for medical information, but provides enough information about impact that a meaningful conversation about whether what is being requested will be effective, will be appropriate, and then enough information for folks to engage in a conversation about alternatives to what is being requested. So it's important to think about it in in both frames. Okay, so the interactive process, it requires disclosure. The person wanting access has to say, hey, I'm a person with a disability. And as a person with a disability, I am entitled to access, and you are required to have a conversation with me about that access. It sucks to have to disclose. It feels vulnerable to say, hey, let me in. And being able to support clients in practicing that conversation, in knowing that that is a precursor to the tools that are needed is an important part of support and practice. The challenges that clients may be disclosing or seeking to address need to be causally connected to the disability, to the functional limitations or impact of that diagnosis in order for to have access to accommodations to redress or mitigate that impact, right? So as you're talking with somebody and they are discussing impact, and this is challenging because you are listening for ways to link that to the diagnoses or the condition, which you are kind of in a position to help identify. It's important to have a conversation about disclosure. And disclosure can happen in one of three ways. Somebody can say, I'm a person with a disability, right? That should signal interactive process and accommodations. Someone can disclose a medical diagnosis and say, like, I'm dyslexic and I'm going to need some support accessing the volume, the tomes of reading that I'm required to do. Or somebody can say, the volume of literature that I am required to do in this short period of time feels unreasonable, right? So there, the functional limitation is disclosed, not the diagnosis. But any of these three ways put the institution on notice. A disclosure has been made. And so this is, again, I'm sharing it with you because the extent to which you are supporting individuals in seeking access, these are three different kind of approaches to what disclosure may look like. It's important to have a conversation about privacy rights once a disclosure is made, and to explore all the reasons why someone may not want to disclose, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Folks with disabilities, especially invisible disabilities, which many mental health conditions fall under, like the queer community, have the option to be in or out. And there are spaces where folks may choose to be in and folks may choose to be out. And there are different dynamics that might inform that decision. Work may not be a universally out space. You may be out with some colleagues and not others. And it has to do sometimes with safety. It has to do sometimes with perception of competency. It may have to do with access to opportunity. And all of those reasons are valid. It also may have to do with not identifying as having a disability, right? And so it may be difficult to engage and ask for accommodation, access, and participation if you are having difficulty identifying and labeling your experience as a disability experience. And so all of those things are important to address in your spaces. Okay, so disability and identity. That brings us to disability and identity. Disability can be a whole identity, right? And I really want to take a minute to talk about stereotypes. And since this is the last of your sessions, I know that you likely have been doing some thinking together and talking about stereotype, a widely held fixed oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. And bias, prejudice or tendency in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually considered to be unfair. Those are like broad definitions that I use. We won't spend a whole time going over these, but I do want to talk about them as they apply to disability just a little bit. Because there can be both negative and positive bias, and they are deeply impactful. So some commonly out there negative stereotypes and bias in the community and in our culture, that folks with disabilities are tragic or pitiful, that they're scary, that they're angry, that we're worthless or incapable, lazy, and undeserving of opportunities. And think a little bit about the way disability is portrayed in like media, like even just Disney, right? Like Captain Hook and what's his name, and Forrest Gump in the wheelchair. Like villains tend to have a disability, even in Marvel, right? Like we tend to not, even when we use language that references the disability experience, it tends not to be positive, right? So that's one thing to acknowledge. There's also positive bias, and it's equally objectifying, right? So that disabled people are inspiring, for example, that managing to get out of bed and like get through the day is somehow an inspiration. And lots of folks with disabilities are inspiring and they are exceptional, but it's not because of their disability. It's because they manage to achieve in spite of perceptions and bias related to their disability. And that folks with disability are, prefer deserve preferential treatment or help or special attention. Like, here's your special accommodations, right? I have a strong aversion to the word special because, what I need is not special. It is the same thing that everybody else needs. I need to be present. I need to be able to do my job. I need to be able to get in the door. I need to be able, and that's not special. That's like what the youth say, mid. It's like basic, right? So, so both negative and positive stereotypes have the same impact. They objectify, and we really need to be aware of this as we support folks with disabilities in getting access, but also as we look to how we're receiving information, right? How we are interacting with the folks that we are supporting, and be aware of how our own bias related to disability may be showing up and how we're receiving information, right? Like, I don't know how you feel about the fact that everyone who walks through your door may be a person entitled to rights under the ADA, right? Like, that may be like, yeah, NBD, duh. It also may be like, I'm sorry, what? I don't know about that, friend. That is a big label. And I think part of the reaction, we see a lot of this, a lot of euphemisms, right? We see disability, we see special needs, we see differently abled, we see the disabled, the blind, the deaf, physically challenged, handy capable. And some people may like these labels. Like all communities, the disability community is not homogenous. Folks, there's an expression I love. You know what they say about knowing a person on the spectrum, a person on the spectrum, right? That it's individualized and you need to engage with the individual. But these things communicate that disability is so bad. It is a bad thing that it cannot be said. I wouldn't dare call you that. I wouldn't dare say that you have rights under the ADA because if I did, then I would be calling you disabled, and that is bad. That is a bad thing, right? I reference language. We say that's insane, that's crazy, lame, you spaz. We say freak. In literature, we see beautiful phrases like turn a blind eye and listen with deaf ears, and we don't flinch at that language. And all of that references disability experience. But when we come to talk about disability, the word itself, saying the word, is very uncomfortable for lots of folks. And so it's important to talk a little bit about anti-saneism and the role that mental health practitioners play in that. It can be really scary for a person with a disability to come to a mental health practitioner because there is a history of violence in care. There is a history of being institutionalized and pathologized, and by virtue of that diagnosis, being stripped of rights. There is ongoing still criminalization of mental health. And so the role of mental health practitioners in the shared history within the disability community that makes us a community is not passive, and can inform how and why people access and how and people engage with you as practitioners. It's really important to examine your service philosophy and what diagnosis and prognosis means for you. And as you establish the goals for therapy, whether fixing it is the lens or frame, right? Are you adopting a medical model wherein somebody's coming in and getting fixed, especially if disability is an important part of their identity? What you are proposing is erasure of a really important part of their history, of their experience, and possibly of their community. So it's important to take some time to think about your own practices, to spend some time. Oh, we don't have a lot of time, but otherwise I would have shared some slides about like just the history of violence visited on folks with mental health over the course of our shared experience. I want to invite us to think, I know we're at time, so a few final thoughts about the intersecting identity. And as we are supporting folks in exploring access and needs, that we think about complexity in identity and context, how intersecting identities might inform how and if they access care, compound impacts, as we're thinking about functional limitation and impact in a major life area, and invite us to think about wholeness and the way that folks are routinely deprived of wholeness as different parts of their identity. The last bit is some inclusion, but I'll get to things like it's important that that you in your own practice are prepared to receive a request for accommodation, right? That folks could physically access every part of your office, that any literature or information you have is available from different heights, that if you have something in writing, you're prepared to deliver it in electronic format, that if you have a front desk person, for example, that they're prepared to receive a phone call from the National Relay Service. It sounds like a sales call, but they're interpreting for somebody who is deaf and doesn't have access to, like Zoom has fixed a lot of that, but it's important not to hang up on those. It's important in your confirming emails as you're confirming appointments that you include an access statement so that folks have the opportunity to tell you about their needs if that is a part of themselves they're already aware of, and have the opportunity to address that in your intake surveys. Asking about disability related needs or request of accommodations is a way that you can demonstrate inclusion in your own practice and awareness around this issue. Yeah, here's the physical spaces, form accesses with the reader, frontline services. Things that you can do on your website. I'll share this as a PDF to go out afterwards so you can have access to a few more of these strategies that you can use practically. And then assess your office's readiness to respond to a request for accommodations. Practice with each other how you might respond. Use simple language. Have clear next steps that you will take in response to a request, and an access statement for all of your communications, including your online presence. And know your disability community, right? Know your local resources. Know if there are like communities or clubs, if get familiar with podcasts, and then as you do your research or participate in other activities, whether they be activist or otherwise, that you acknowledge the contributions of the disabled and the disability community in your own work. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Very informative and really helpful and practical examples for social workers to take away. I'd like to introduce our first reflector, Rihanna Howard. Rihanna Howard is a second-year doctoral student at BU School of Social Work. Rihanna is interested in researching Black students' involvement in organizing and social movements, impacts of educational policies, and how education systems perpetuate trauma, especially for students of color. Her work is rooted in educational equity practices and assisting in breaking down systemic barriers in the educational system. Take it away, Rihanna.
Yeah. Thank you, Isabel, for such a wonderful presentation. I really like how you described and went in detailed a lot about the law, around language when describing disabilities, but also language around supporting as well too. I really appreciate the in-depth scope around accommodations and also centering the individual and everything that you talked about. I know that you had the slide up and you briefly talked about it, but I was wondering if you can say more about the anti-Satanism, I think that's how you pronounced it, and how that can show up within everyday work of somebody who's working in the field of mental health.
Yeah, so maybe the fastest way that I could describe it is that we live in a society that like polices everything about our bodies and sanity and favors sanity and defines sort of like the paradigm for how you demonstrate sanity. And that looks pretty white. It looks a certain kind of way, right? And any presentation or engagement outside of that norm or that range, we have a bias against, right? So if somebody is walking down the street and they are not walking and engaging in open space within that range of normalcy, we may fear them. We may think that they're on drugs. We may criminalize that presentation of being in the world. And it's important to think about that in three ways, really. One, how our own bias and our own experience of folks we support is informed by that bias, right? Like to what extent is that range of normal informing my diagnosis and my experience of the person speaking to me. Also, being aware of how I identify impacts, strategies, and supports for how they may be perceived by others, and address those like, hey friend, you don't have a problem with how you are, this is working for you, like right on, but it sounds like there's a misalignment between how your standards and your community standards, right? And so then the conversation isn't about how we change you or how you modify your behavior. Then it's like, how do we develop strategies so that you can better engage with a community that has a bias against how you present? And that's a really different conversation then let's fix it. You know, what are we fixing? And what kinds of tools are we developing together? I don't know if that helps.
No, that was helpful. Thank you so much for explaining it more in depth. And again, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Rihanna. Thank you for your reflection and your question. I'm going to introduce our second reflector, colleague and friend, Bethlyn Virgo Houlihan is a project director for the Center for Innovation in Social Work and Health at the BU School of Social Work. Bethlyn received her MSW and Master's in Public Health from our dual degree program. Her work focuses on centering disability in care innovation and design in partnership with people with lived experience, lived expertise across the lifespan to ensure that people can flourish and thrive in their own communities. One of her current projects, led by Dr. Amy Haltrow at the University of Pittsburgh, aims to identify solution-based innovations to improve health and wellness outcomes for children with disabilities who are multiply marginalized. Bethlyn?
Hey, thank you. It's really wonderful to be here. I already feel like I've been learning things. I was writing things down as you're talking and the way that you're able to speak to it as well, so eloquently. And simply, I really appreciate that. I love the way you talk about that, just the thinking of rather than universal design as inclusive design. I think that that's just a great way to think about how we are able to continually approach and recognize that we're all still learning together, and it's about that engagement and like sincere effort and genuine effort to do that together. So I just wanted to call that out and say I feel like in the work that we do, you kind of hear like it's if people don't feel like you're actually going to, if they can't tell that you're willing to engage, they might not even try to go there, right? If they don't feel like you're proactively making sure that there's an open and welcoming space, they may not even be willing to try to disclose or say anything. And that's not that anyone means to do that. So I just feel like that was just it's a fantastic point to bring up. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to, I feel like sometimes there is also a bias to think that mental health and disability are necessarily interconnected. So I was hoping you might speak to that a little bit for everybody, because I think that's an important thing for people to understand.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you, okay, so we didn't get to a social model of disability, right? Which says it's not about your diagnoses, it's about your environment, right? So I'm going to use like a really terrible example. But like during the pandemic, that Bird Box movie with Sandra Bullock, where like, right, like she had to, you couldn't go outside because if the bad thing saw your eyeballs, like that is what was causing the world devastation. But she comes upon like an oasis of an unaffected community where everybody's thriving, where society has not gone to, to heck, and it is a blind school, right? Because in that environment, folks were able to not be impacted by the negative thing in the environment. And I know that that is not mental health exactly, right? But there is a difference between diagnosis and expectations for participation that require engagement in the area of functional limitation, right? So just because you have a mental health diagnosis does not mean that necessarily that you are in an environment or in a career that is disabling, right? And so that is really, really important. It's also different than disability identity, right? So I'll use, even though it's not mental health, I'll use dyslexia in grade school. Right. So in grade school, now they're doing a much better job, but it used to be that if you needed like speech pathology or additional support around reading, you would stand up in front of all of your classmates and get paraded out to the special reading class. Right. And right. So you may have acquired sufficient skills, strategies, etc., to be able to read at the same level, at the same speed, perhaps at even higher comprehension than your peers. So following that intervention, your diagnoses may not be disabling. The stigma of being othered and objectified, right, and paraded and excluded from participation in your classroom, that may stay with you. You and the other kids that got paraded out, you're homies now for life. And with everyone else across the country that got paraded out. And you may have some synergy or some hermandad with the ESL kids, because they had to stand up and they got paraded out too, right? And that cultural experience is fundamentally tied to identity. And that's an opportunity too, right? That your mental health diagnosis may not mean that you have a disability, but it may present an opportunity for supporting the building of community. And access to community may be a critical part of therapy and of the interventions, because it's access to other humans who human like you that might be missing for you, right? Those humans that human like you, they might have the strategies for success that are important for you, right? And so there's a distinction between disability as diagnosis, disability as a protected category, and disability as identity, right? They're all different, but it's really important to get fluid and comfortable with the fact that a diagnosis could mean disability, and thinking about, well, which kind is it, right? Is it a medical disability? Is it one that entitles you to legal protection and support? Can it be a basis for the development of self-identity, right? Self-understanding and access to community.
Love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethlyn. We have our third reflector. Daniel Doe is a public health social worker and the 2013-2014 graduate of our MSW MPH program. Currently, Dan serves as the president of the BU School of Social Work Alumni Board and is a fourth-year doctoral candidate at the School of Social Work. Dan's research interests include addressing systems of racism in mental health treatment through training and policy interventions to advance health equity. His pronouns are he, him, and his.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks, Isabel, for this lovely talk. I was so excited, I took notes. And the one thing that I kept coming back to was something you said so early on, which is so important, is when we're working with disability and accommodations, it is not a kindness. I tell people all the time, I'm like, do not expect a thank you for doing what you should do anyhow. Do not expect a thank you. Like when someone says and someone brings it to your attention is you should just change it because that's what we need to do anyhow in this world of inclusive design and universal design. And so I'm like, you do not get a cookie. You do not get a gold star for you. It's not a kindness for that individual. And I often think about social work and how we train around social justice. And I hear students sometimes say these words and I'm like, of like differently abled and whatnot. And I'm real curious as to where it comes from. And it often comes from a good spot. I'm like, hey, are you saying that from our privileged perspective or your privileged perspective of not having a disability and really challenging them towards it? And that part around language, something that I've done a lot in my career is to challenge both doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, and social workers who provide mental health care around their language behind closed doors that is even more stigmatizing around mental health. And so think about how we need to keep each other accountable in this process. And I know for me in my practice, I work a lot with adults who are then diagnosed with ADHD and what does that mean and stigma and social representations and writing accommodations forms. And so Isabel, I have like questions for you. Also just love the talk and the concepts is I often like to give students like, hey, reflection questions that you can check in with yourself about. What are some biases that you might hold? Recognizing that we all have implicit biases and that we need to address them as a lifelong ethical commitment in our code of ethics as social workers to address our biases. So I don't know if you have any frameworks for our audience in terms of like good self-reflective questions, just to check in, like check in with ourselves and or like ways of having conversations with the clients around when you're writing an accommodation letter. Helpful ways to do that. So either or question.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate like acknowledgement that it's not a kindness, right? Because it's not like a helping thing, and using the framework of rights is really important. So that's one of the reasons why language really matters. Like the Americans with Disabilities Act literally centers disability. Right. And if it is a label that you're uncomfortable with, availing yourselves of those protections becomes really challenging, especially because that framework requires disclosure. Right. So giving students a frame of like, you're not asking for help, you're asserting your rights when you ask for notes, when you ask for extensions on time, I think is really a helpful reframe and like thought as far as like a prompt, right? Like how does it feel to frame your request rather than a request as an assertion of rights? Like, could you say that as it is my right to have blank in order to blank, I need blank, right? And to reframe the request that way. And how does that feel? Early on for myself, right? I often tried on like, introduce yourself and say, and I have a disability. I'm a member of the disability community, and sit. Why is that uncomfortable? Like, what is coming up for you? And let's talk through that. Like, what is that about? And like, does it feel good? When does it feel good? When doesn't it feel good? Right? Like when does it feel safe to be out? Why doesn't it feel safe to be out? And those are also like lots of like furtive spaces. It's important when you're writing a letter of accommodation, for example, to do it together, almost like a co-author opportunity, because disclosure could be the condition, could be that you have a disability, or it could be the functional limitation. Knowing that you could say, I am working with blank who has a disability, it is enough. That's enough, right? Or if that doesn't feel comfortable, you can use the functional limitation instead, right? To say, who is experiencing challenges with focus and attention, right? And therefore needs, you're making the because statement, X the following things, right? So that I would say is a really like empowering way of doing it. Writing your accommodations letter as a draft and sharing it, like, I mean, obviously not delivered because you would need to, like, there's privacy concerns and integrity concerns there, but like offering it as a session where it's a draft and we're gonna, what do you think about that? How does that feel? There isn't a mystery about it, what it says or who it, asking about differentiation. Would you rather, do you need one universal one that you're just going to take here to the Disabled Student Services office? Or do you need one for work and one for school? Do you need one for this particular like instance, right? So asking about differentiation also could be a really empowering kind of opportunity to have. I'm seeing like the chat blow up. I'm sorry.
Let's go, and love that, especially around the distinction that we don't need to disclose everything. And I think that's a reminder that many people need is what is the client comfortable with disclosing and what is really necessary on the form, and knowing the ADA legal language is so key. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for your question. Thank you for your reflection. So we're gonna shift gears and take questions from our audience. I think we have time for 2 questions. And we had some that came through over the last couple minutes. So the first question that came in, which is, I'm curious about the impact of disability justice or injustice on a disabled person's mental health, secondary to any disability diagnosis, not focusing on a mental health diagnosis as a disability, but how the injustice or injustices impact mental health.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's deep. So I'll say, I wanted to respond to in Dan's comment, right? That like how we talk to each other as colleagues says a lot about it presumes exclusion, right? We think when we make those comments that we are in an in-group and that nobody that we're talking to belongs to the group that we're disparaging. That is especially harmful for folks who we presume are not present, who are. It signals their safety in coming out. So that's also really important. And I'll use maybe like professors, for example, right? So professors sometimes at faculty meetings will discuss, oh, I'm getting all of these accommodation letters. Don't they know that that's actually detrimental to their career? A comment like that presumes an exclusive space where other faculty members are not themselves members of the disability community, right? It communicates to those folks that it's not a safe space to be out in, and signals non-belonging, right? So if we're having a conversation as practitioners, as if there were no folks with disabilities in the room, then that itself is it's an exclusive paradigm that causes harm, both because it signals outwardly that folks with disabilities do not belong, and signals to those folks who are incognito in that they do not belong, right? So that is one example of, for example, mental health impact from exclusion or injustice, right? And then I would say that the other thing that this points to is why it's so important to talk about disability when we're talking about equity and inclusion and belonging in a social justice framework is that it is an aspect of a lived experience. It is human. It is part of the human experience, and to not include it when we're talking about community is erasure, right? And so and does harm, right? And then I want to like point to a part of my presentation, the legal standard that talking about disability brings to the table is dignity and respect. And it is so unique that the Office of Civil Rights under the Department of Education, in examining institutional response, is looking at the institutional response through a lens of like, was this dignified? Never mind, was it economical or was it did this deny the dignity of this person, right? And so including that perspective in a broader like inclusion framework is really important. And I'll say, like in this national moment, acknowledging the harmful mental health impact of racism, of exclusion, of, I mean, I won't even call them microaggressions, like microaggression centers everybody else's experience, right? It's like, and death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? So yeah, that is an additional lens. Like someone may be coming in for one reason, and you may need to develop a support plan around like, how are you navigating bias? How are you navigating those microaggressions? Do you have access to support community, right? So disability identity or helping to foster the development of that identity, whether it's a diagnosis or not, may be an important element in helping to mitigate that kind of impact that question kind of highlights for us.
Thank you. Thank you. So our second question from the Zoom audience, how do you think we can encourage more folks with disabilities to become social workers? As a social worker with a disability, I have been asked to call my clients and let them know I'm a wheelchair user in case they want to back out.
So first, yikes, I want to say I'm sorry you've had that experience. And this conversation is a good example of how we might increase the number of folks with disabilities wanting to engage in the work and become social workers. I think that, one general thing is that, Dan pointed out, lots of social workers want to help. This is a helping profession, right? Teachers want to help. It is a helping profession. So reframing the work itself as not a helping profession, reframing the work as like as equity work, as public health work, you pick your frame, whatever it is. But shifting that frame will invite other kinds of folks in. There's a long history of violence visited and perpetrated on folks with disabilities by people who wanted to help, by nurses and priests, right? And so shifting away from those models, like from medical models of service, shifting away from that will have a big impact for who feels like that's a savior complex, for that's a safe space for folks. Another is, being self-reflective, right? So as we have these conversations, I tried to say, well, and in your own practice and in your own bias and in your own, like, how is sanism impacting the way you're experiencing the testimony, like the lived experience this person is sharing with you, right? The more we're willing to have self-reflective conversations, the more people may be open to sharing that they are already here, right? So that's also a really big thing. The other is, and like, I hate framing it this way because it gives me the ick and I like don't quite have words for why, but like disability is not like a static identity. You may become disabled as you age. Your physiomorphology may change, you may have an accident, you may, right? And it feels ick to be like, any one of us could be disabled one day, right? Because that feels like erasing some of those like historical lived experiences around which we built community. And it's true, right? It's true that as we live life, our experiences may lead us to, like in response to trauma, develop conditions which may be impactful in a way that present and functional limitations that severely impact our ability to sleep, to school, to work, etc. Right? And so it's really important that we understand this conversation as a personal, like we each, all of us personally, have a stake in this, both as folks who may benefit from the inclusion practices we help implement, and also, again, that frame, right? It is not a help. Making sure that all voices are present at the table has an inherent value for the community, right? Like when only dudes were designing cars, there was like race cars and coupes. And then like women got invited to the table, and like now we've got like cup holders and like SUVs and like subcompact, like, you know, because we mob with our whole family, like, you know, and cars are better. There's more choices, right? So if diversity drives innovation, right, making sure that it is a like professional priority to have more kinds of folks present will drive innovation in the field. I don't know if that was helpful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for that. We want to sort of wrap up and thank everyone for attending tonight. Our wonderful speaker, Isabel Alvarado Dees, our insightful reflectors, Rihanna Howard, Bethlyn Virgo Houlihan, and Daniel Doe, and our amazing behind the scenes MSW student and tech assistant, Ashley Shen. And one more reminder that if you are getting CEUs, you must complete the form using the link that we have put here in the chat. And I'll sort of wrap up with saying, in the movement, we like to say that the path to justice is more like a marathon and not a sprint. Take good care of yourselves, everyone, because we all need you to create our new world. We hope to see you at our Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series next academic year. Have a wonderful summer, and we'll see you in the fall. Thank you all.